Today we're talking about creating a photo book with Photo Cascadia, and you're listening to the Landscape Photography Podcast. Greetings, everybody. You might be watching or listening to this week's episode. We just got done having an interview with the Photo Cascadia team, or at least 4 of the 7 of Photo Cascadia. I just got done talking to David Cobb, Sean Bagshaw, Kevin McNeal, and Erin Babnik, and we talked about their new book, Washington Evergreen. So their new book is just about to come out, and we talked about the importance of having a photo project that help keep you motivated, as well as what goes into creating a photo book like this. If you're interested in someday creating a photo book of your own, you might find this episode interesting. And if you're just a fan of photography, you might find this week's episode interesting. Hopefully you do. Let's jump into the conversation that I just had with David Cobb, Kevin McNeal, Sean Bagshaw, and Erin Babnik about their new book, Washington Evergreen. I am sitting down with Photo Cascadia. Well, like 4 of them anyway. So we got Erin Babnik, we have David Cobb, we have Kevin McNeal, and we have Sean Bagshaw. I've been looking forward to having you guys on. It's good to talk to you guys.
Great to be here.
Awesome to be here, Nick.
So the reason that we're having you on currently is that you have a new book coming out. Erin, maybe you can talk a little bit about what the new book is and when it's going to be out and stuff.
This is a follow-up in a series. It started with this one, which is Oregon, My Oregon, Land of Natural Wonders. Timber Press approached us about doing this book with the idea that if this went well, we might also do one on Washington State. So that's what happened. And the new one, Washington Evergreen, is just about to be released to bookstores everywhere. And we're super excited about it. It's basically a massive project that pulled together all of the team's photos, and we are super excited to see it come out.
So Erin, you just sent me a PDF of it, and the images inside are incredible, as you would expect. Most people, when they put together photo books, they're doing it as kind of a solo thing. You know, they're putting all their own images in it. But you guys, as a team, there's 7 in Photo Cascadia, correct?
Correct.
It has to be a little bit different to do this as a collaborative effort. Sean, what are some of the, I guess, benefits and hurdles you have to jump over to do this as kind of a joint effort?
Well, I guess the benefits of doing it as a team the way we are is just that we have such a big body of work to draw from and lots of photographers. So when you're doing a book on an entire state, that's a lot of photos and that's a lot of areas. You know, a lot of people would go to, maybe a handful of well-known locations in a state, or maybe if they live in that state, maybe in their local area. But to really have the kind of depth and breadth of covering an entire state, it's a big project. So having 7 of us who have photographed in Washington for, some of us, almost 2 decades, really gave us a big body of work to draw from to start with. And then also, it also made it, when we're filling in the gaps of areas that we still needed more coverage of, we could kind of divide and conquer and send people out to different parts of the state as well. So those are the benefits. And also a benefit of, when we're working together as a team, Photo Cascadia, we've gelled well for over a decade now. We work together well, so we have fun on these kinds of projects. Challenges is, I think for us, probably the biggest thing is just the coordination of trying to coordinate 7 people who are all over different parts of the world and going different directions and have different things going on in their lives and their own businesses all the time. So trying to create that coordination can be a little bit tricky, but we've developed some pretty good systems for that over the years.
One of the things that I appreciated about the book, especially as an Eastern Washington guy, is that there was some areas that are not as heavily photographed in the book. I might have been your image, Sean, but there was one of the Grand Ronde area that is, never gets the love that, a lot of the western part of the state gets. I really appreciated how diverse the images were. There was a lot of central Washington, which is not an easy part of the state to photograph. In fact, sometimes it can be downright ugly, let alone not being super photogenic, but it's kind of rough to photograph. How did you guys each go about deciding which images end up in a book like this? Maybe we'll direct this one at you, David. How did you go back through your catalog and decide which images make it and which images did not?
Well, a lot of us had images from the popular areas like Olympic National Park, Rainier National Park, Mount St. Helens, and the Palouse, obviously. And so we pooled our images together, and we had a rule that you can only have 7 images from those popular places because we knew that we each had 1 million. And so we had to narrow it down right off the bat with those places. And once we got a pool together, then we could say, okay, here's the holes that we have, and here's where we can fill it in, and here's our game plan for attack and how to photograph these areas. And then we just kind of called each other and said, hey, I'm going this place this time. Do you want to join me? And then we just had fun and got together and shot those places and photographed in lesser known areas, and got to stay in Sean's nice van. So that was always fun too. And, just kind of had our marching orders at that point. And from there, we pulled all our images, and then the publisher came in and they were the final curation. So it was nice not to have us curate the final images, because then it's like saying, giving away your favorite kid or something like that. So that part's tough. So the publisher took it out of our hands and put it into their hands, and that made it a lot easier.
Kind of follow up on what you said, Nick, about some of the parts of Washington that are less well known. And that was a really fun part of that whole process for me. And I know David and Adrian spent quite a bit of time, and Zach too, I think, were the main ones that kind of went out into those kind of central and eastern Washington locations that I think a lot of people don't know about. One of the things that was really exciting for me to see out there and interesting was Oregon, which a lot of us from Oregon, Eastern Oregon is very, a lot of just open country. Eastern Washington, I was surprised, and I traveled in Eastern Washington, but I was surprised to see just how developed it is. I mean, there's a lot of agriculture, there's a lot of private land, and the places that are more kind of wild and photogenic for landscape photography are these little pockets or islands kind of isolated out there. And I think I realized that you guys have so much more water in the east part of the state than we do, with all the big rivers, Snake River and the Columbia River and the Grand Ronde and the Pend Oreille and all those big rivers that run through there. You've got water for development and agriculture and that kind of stuff. But yeah, you can't just drive into Eastern Washington and find those photogenic landscapes like you can in Oregon. But when we did find them and kind of research where they were and got to them, really interesting little pockets out there in that part of the state.
Yeah, and it's really fun as a photographer to photograph those areas, because they're really areas that are not photographed often at all. And so it's not easy to do online research, but when you can go out and, drive on these back roads and not see another car for hours at a time, it's really fun as a photographer, because you know that you're creating work that has probably not been created, before, as opposed to going to a popular overlook somewhere, maybe on the western part of the state, simply just because it's heavily populated. More often than not, somebody has already taken that shot. But in Eastern Washington, there's just not a lot of photography done, other than the popular places like the Steptoe Buttes and the Palouse Falls and, areas of the Palouse region that get a lot of photographers rolling through. So one of the things I'm curious of is, when you have a project like this, but you also have such a huge back catalog of images like a lot of you do, how much of this book was, how much of it came from the back catalog, and how much of it had to be, stuff that was shot specifically for the project? Maybe we'll ask that to you, Kevin.
That's a good question you asked me, because I happen to have a really back catalog, and I haven't done a whole lot except for the main areas, because I've been doing a lot of workshop of the main areas. So my back catalog of some of the more, least seen areas were from 10, 12, 14 years ago, and processing and everything was so much different then. And so that was definitely an issue, and still an issue for me all this day, because my big body of work, the good work, is actually 12 years, 14 years old. And sometimes that's outdated. The image of the processing looks outdated, and you just can't go back and reprocess everything. So again, that was something I struggled with, and I still struggle with all the time. Is that the images that are well known, the ones that I have known for, are very old. So it looks almost, it's got that HDR-ish look and stuff, and it's not as bad as the Flickr days of where everything was purple, but yeah. Definitely, that I struggle with that probably a lot, and I know, So that's a good question.
Yeah,
Definitely
and Kevin's catalog. Kevin lives in Washington. He's one of the 2 Photo Cascadia members that live in Washington, and Kevin is prolific. So he really carried a lot of this project because he had photographs for years and from places that we didn't even know about, that Kevin knows about because he lives there and he's out photographing so much. But I think probably in response to like how much of this came from the archives, our Photo Cascadia archives, I want to say probably 80% of the images were images that we had already taken before we started this project. And that's just off the top of my head. And then the rest of them, we were able to go out and create new imagery specifically for the book. But that's one of, again, the strengths of having this group, that we have 7 of us and that we've been doing this for so long, is to have that sort of backlog, because otherwise to do a whole book of this magnitude on one state from scratch, if you didn't have some of that backlog, would be a many years long project. We've spent 15 years gathering these photos, and to just go out like over the course of a single year and try to really get the coverage as comprehensive, and also with all the varying conditions and atmosphere and light and seasons and all of that stuff, you really couldn't accomplish that in a short time frame.
There has to be a pretty big benefit to having some kind of project like this, that you're looking forward to, and you have a good solid purpose to go out and do photography rather than because I like it, and that's one of the struggles that I'm constantly going through myself, is like, I know that I'm capable of taking a pretty picture once in a while, but I start to ask myself, but why do I take pretty pictures? And that's a much more difficult, question to answer. And it can turn into a bit of a block for myself. But I think that, having a project like this has to have some major motivational benefits to, to wanting to be motivated to get out and to go shoot, because you have a good solid reason to, right?
Totally. I think I actually wrote a book, Photo Cascadia blog, on having a project and what that means. And a big part for me is it just gives me direction. It gives me a purpose and gives me a direction with my photography, knowing that there's a chance that these photos will be published, and that's something to work for, and I enjoy that. So I give myself self projects, like photographing ghost towns in the west of the Mississippi, or photographing Idaho, or photographing Montana, and I just use those projects to fill in holes for a state, or just to get out there and have fun and to backpack. And for the Washington project, it was fun because I just always wanted to go to the Pasayten Wilderness, which is in the eastern part of the state that borders Canada. And to go back there with the camera, it's fabulous. It's like the North Cascades in a way, but it's in the east. So there's just a lot of different flora and fauna that live there, and the mountains are spectacular, and it was just fun to be there. And I got snowed on, so that was kind of cool too.
The excitement of doing a project oftentimes extends way beyond that impetus and motivation to actually go out and create more content. I think that part of the big excitement for us was revisiting what we had and taking a look at it as a whole, and that self-curation, that process that we went through, and the rediscovery of moments that we'd had before. And that's pretty exciting to get that material and shape it into something is, I think, just as exciting as actually trying to go out and create new stuff, because, we are kind of always doing that. I don't think any of us really needs a project for that kind of motivation. We love getting out and shooting, but you kind of do need a project to get into those old photos and really see what you've got there and what you can make of it in a way that other people can enjoy them, as a body of work.
It's something that I've kind of discovered for myself lately, is that the more very specific constraints you give yourself, there's something liberating in that. And that's not something I ever really, never really dawned on me before. But the more specific your constraints are, the more it frees you up to, more happily work within them. Sometimes when you have, it's kind of like, bear with me here. It's kind of like when you get on Netflix looking for something, anything to watch, and you are just bombarded with options, and you end up just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and nothing looks good because you have too many options. It's kind of like that for me sometimes, where, I have too many options, but as soon as I give myself a set of constraints to work within, then suddenly I'm happy again and I'm creative again. And it's very strange that something limiting can also be liberating, if that makes sense. So when you guys decide which images are going to make it into a book or a project, do you go back and try to reprocess them with your current set of skills, or are you just going back and doing little tweaks where, it makes it, sharpening for print or something like that? Are you just getting it ready for print, or are you actually going back and starting from the original source files and reprocessing them with new eyes? How about you, Sean?
I think that my older photos, probably varied. I think I looked at some of my older images and felt like, oh yeah, that looks great to me still, and there's not a lot that I can improve on that, so that's good to go. But I definitely found, I would say probably the majority of my images, I thought the older ones would benefit from reworking and starting over from scratch. And and as we know, as capabilities improve and as technology improves and all of that, I have a better capability of creating an image I really like now than some of the stuff I did 10 or 12 years ago. So re-editing was a big part of that process. And that was fun to do as well, to go back and revisit some images that I really hadn't considered for a long time, and then to look at them with fresh eyes. And it's just something I never probably would have done otherwise. And then also even just looking at images that I had never developed, because I had these raw files sitting there that I photographed and never really had a sense of them or a connection to them or a reason to use them. But now in the context of a book like this and a collection like this, I also all of a sudden had a reason. And so I actually worked up many images that I'd never even touched before. So that was great as well.
How about the rest of you? Go ahead, Erin.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'm kind of notorious for being probably overly selective about what I process and release. And this project did force me to kind of go back and drag out something for and I'm glad I did, because it was one of those sitting there just asking to be processed, but I just moved on and forgot about it, and now it's out there. So,
yeah. So obviously this is not your first book that you've worked on together. You also have done Oregon, My Oregon. Were there any things that you learned from doing the first book that went into helping with this second book? Obviously, something of this magnitude, there's always going to be those things that you learn along the way. Was there anything that you learned from creating the first book that helped you in creating the second book?
I think working with a publisher was a little bit easier with a second book because it was new to a lot of us and the publisher was new to us. So what their interests were, what their deadlines were, and working on those schedules that they had set. So the second time around, I think we had a track record with them and we knew what to expect and what our timeline probably would be. So I think we were just more prepared the second time around than we were the first time.
It was definitely nice also that, these two books are two books in a series. So they're the same format and layout and design. So we didn't have to do too much decision making around, what would be the format of the book and what would it look like. We just had to get the images together. And a lot of those decisions had already been made with the Oregon book. We just applied them to the Washington book. And a lot of those decisions were made by the publisher anyway. But it was just nice, it was a really familiar landscape to be working in because we'd already done it once.
Yeah, I was just going to add that Timber Press, being as good as they are, the top probably in their field for those types of books as a publisher, they are just extremely easy to work with. They're very organized. Everything went really smooth. And so I felt like both of the projects went very smoothly, and there wasn't a huge difference in the second one, largely due to the way that their guidance was just so clear and organized, which really helped us.
When you're going back and you're reprocessing an image that is going to make it into this book, for those that don't print a whole lot, what kinds of different things are you doing when you're processing an image that is going to print as opposed to going to be displayed on the web? Maybe Sean, I know you have a tutorial on the subject, so maybe you can talk a little bit about what are some of the things that you're likely to do different in an image that is going straight to print.
Well, and that is a good question, and I think it's a little bit different here. So definitely, when we're printing to print our images to large photo prints or on canvas or whatever kind of fine art printing that we're doing, there's definitely a process to that. This was a very different thing. I mean, I think maybe if we were doing self-publishing, then we would have been responsible for a lot more of that. But working with a publisher, and especially one of Timber Press's caliber, they have people for all that. So they really just wanted us to deliver our files, our edited files, our finished images. But then in terms of the type of printing, which I assume is some sort of offset printing that they're using, and their printer that they use, which is, I think, overseas somewhere, and their photo editors and all that, they did all of that work. So in this situation, that made that really easy for us, I guess, is that we didn't have to worry about prepping these images specifically for the book output.
That's actually really interesting. That was one of my questions, would be like, what's the difference between sending something to be printed, 40 by 60 versus something in the size of a photo book? I would imagine you could be a little bit more aggressive with sharpening and things like that just because it's being displayed a little smaller. That's fascinating that the publisher would actually help take care of that. That's really nice.
That's, they're publishing books all the time, and they have people that's their profession, and that's that's their area. And they also know the printers that they work with that have all these various specifications. And those are all things that, photographers probably, unless you're, like I said, self-publishing your own book, don't have an opportunity to work in those modes. And so it would be probably difficult. It'd be a lot of trial and error there to do. But I think the process on their end is still fairly similar to what you would do printing your own prints. There's still going to be, printer and paper profiles that will determine how to take the digital image and convert that to what the printer is going to print, and then how to do soft proofing and deciding on things like sharpening and brightness and contrast and all of those kinds of things, so that what's reproduced on that particular print medium, in this case in the book paper, is as close to the original as it can be. So I'm sure that process is all there for them, which is going to look similar to what we do printing our photos as photographers, as big prints.
So I'm sure that we have a lot of people listening that, aspire to create something like this for themselves someday. Maybe we can go kind of one by one and give a piece of advice for people that are kind of thinking about someday, maybe way down the road, creating a photo book of their own, or maybe working towards a project like this. David, what kind of advice would you have for someone that's, aspiring to do something like this someday?
Well, I think when you go out to photograph, publishers don't always want red sky. They want a variety of skies. They want morning sky. They want a great sunset, but some blue sky stuff mixed in too. And they don't always want the grand landscape. They want the medium-sized landscape and the smaller scene, or even the macro scene, to just kind of mix things up and include those in the book too. So if you are interested in a book like this, a little bit of variety in your shooting is always helpful.
How about you, Erin? Do you have any advice for someone kind of working towards a goal like that?
Well, it's interesting for us. This dropped in our lap, literally. Timber Press approached us with the idea. So it's not like we came up with that idea to begin with. But I would say that if anyone is interested in starting the process on their own, that a good way to start really is to look at threads in your work that you can develop further and something that's going to be really fun for you so that it evolves organically out of what you do already, rather than making it into something that seems so daunting that you'll never take the right steps to get towards the finish line, just because it just seems kind of overwhelming. For us, it was just easy because Timber Press came to us with this, pitched us this idea. We were excited. We jumped on it. We already had, like Sean said, maybe 80% of the images for this book and maybe more for Oregon. But if you're starting from scratch, let it evolve organically out of what it is that excites you and what's fun for you.
I think you have to, as mentioned before, you have to photograph something that you enjoy. You can't start guessing what people will like. I think it has to be something that you really, that's special to you. You have your story and you have to tell the world that story. And I think that story comes through with pictures. But if you're thinking and trying to guess what other people will like, you'll never win. So it has to be something that you really, really enjoy. And it doesn't have to necessarily be all the iconic places, but it has to be something that means something to you and definitely makes you unique. And I think if you tell your story, that will come out on the pages.
I think, yeah, for a book project, deciding, what kind of book it is that you're interested in doing. Of course, I think all of us would like to have kind of here's Sean Bagshaw's best photos of his life all in one book. And I would love to have a Sean Bagshaw best photos book, but I don't know that anybody else does. And I don't know how many publishers think, hey, that's a hot item. Everyone's looking for that book. But I'm not saying that's not a worthwhile project to do, but I think in a lot of cases, getting unless you're an Art Wolf or, somebody with a big name, to get a publisher on board, something like that might be a little difficult. So that's where maybe thinking more towards self-publishing. And I know a lot of our friends and colleagues have self-published their own kind of portfolio photo books, which are beautiful. And I own many of them and I love them. But I think that's a lot of times would be hard to attract a publisher if you're looking to attract a publisher, because publishing your own book is a lot of money and a huge amount of work. Having a publisher involved means that they're upfronting the costs, they're taking care of marketing and distribution, and they're getting it out into all the bookstores and the online booksellers and doing all of that stuff, which is great. But for them, it has to be, this is a book that we think is something that we can actually market and sell. And so that's, having a theme, this idea of taking states, a whole book on just Oregon or a whole book on just Washington. Or David has published a couple of his own books on gardens, Japanese gardens and other types of gardens. And so that's this kind of real kind of specific theme that has an interest group. So if you're looking for a publisher, maybe kind of going along and thinking on those terms of what would be not just interest to me, but what would be an interest to a bigger audience. And I don't know, maybe David has some ideas to put in there since he's the one who's actually done more of that.
Yeah, well, the Japanese garden books were through Tuttle Publishing, which is a publisher in Vermont. And it was something they were interested in. They liked my photos and I had an idea and pitched it to them. So going to a publisher and pitching an idea is something you can work on. So if you think you've got an idea, you think you have a niche, you think a publisher might be interested in it, then approach them, have a meeting, call them up. They're always approachable, and they're always, just like the internet is always interested in content. Well, publishers are interested in content too, and they are interested in publishing books. So if you've got a good idea, let them know about it, and they may take you up on that. And that's what I did with the Japanese garden books.
I also think another smart thing that you did, David, is you associated yourself with a well-known author in that area of Japanese gardens, and so that was another part of the attraction. This was we're for the most part photographers. Some of us are better writers than others, but we're generally, as a group, not authors. We're photographers. So to find someone, if you want text with your book, to find someone, if you're not an author, find an author. And David found an author who already had published his own books and was known in the Japanese garden kind of genre. And once he had him on board as part of the package, that I think probably made it just even that much more attractive to the publisher. And also for these two books, for the Oregon and Washington books, we were able to find, even though they're not really long-based textbooks, so it's just about the images, they're picture books, but we do have very lengthy forwards in both of them, written by well-known authors as well. And so just having those forwards combined with these well-known authors, I think really helps sell the book and make it appealing not only to book buyers, but also to publishers. So finding somebody like that to partner with could be a good idea.
Yeah, and I think to kind of add on is that a person should also keep in mind the scope of what they're attempting to cover. The Photo Cascadia is a group of 7 photographers with massive back catalogs. And for that reason, you were able to pull off entire regions. Washington and Oregon, that's a huge amount of land you covered. And it's a huge amount of very photogenic areas. And if it was a single person, that would be way harder to cover. So I think a little piece of advice that I would give is to maybe focus on a smaller region or a smaller category or whatever it is, to keep the scope small enough to where it's doable. It's not overwhelming. And, maybe it's a region that hasn't been done to death. I've often thought about doing one where I'm like the Oregon coast. And then I think about all of the Oregon coast books and images that are out there. Like it would be pretty redundant if I did something like that. And for that reason, I think, if I was to do it, I would focus on my own little region that hasn't been photographed nearly as much. And it would be very smaller in scope. But because it's smaller in scope, it would represent a larger portion of the amount of photography that's out there from that region, if that makes sense. So just keeping the scope a little bit smaller, I think, would help keep it from being quite so daunting. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So where can people find the book and when will it be out?
It will be out. It's released October 22nd, 2022. And it can be found in any bookstore. It's got major distribution, so it can be found on Amazon if you want to buy it there. It can be found at your local bookstore, or if there's chain bookstores like Borders, where they exist, or Barnes and Noble. Yeah, then it can be found there too.
Powell's, Books A Million, you name it. And we always encourage people also to go to your local bookseller, support your local bookstore in the town you live, and go see if they have it, buy it from them. And if they don't have it, ask them if they'll order it for you.
And as I've said before, I have the Oregon, My Oregon. It's a beautiful book. It's really well put together. And I've seen the images that are in the Washington book, and they are beautiful and inspiring. And I'll also mention that the Photocascadia website and blog has so many great resources and, just great stuff for photography enthusiasts. So I highly recommend you go and check out the Photocascadia website. Thank you guys so much for coming on. It's always good to chat with you guys. We'll have you on again. And it's been good. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Nick. This is awesome. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to your book.
Whenever that'll be. I need to figure out what my book will be about before I ever have a book. Someday I will. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for watching or listening. And we'll catch you guys next time. Take it easy, everybody.